losing touch with what those lessons were that helped to build this wonderful civilization?
Well, there's been this appalling 180-degree turn over the past 15 years when it comes to what is the best way to deal with supposedly false or harmful speech. So the prevailing wisdom amongst our ruling elites across the Western world until about 15 years ago is what's known as the counterspeech doctrine, set out in a famous US Supreme Court case, I think in 1919, in which Justice Louis Brandeis said that the best way to deal with false or misleading or harmful speech is not to suppress it, but to counter it with more and better speech. That's the counter-speech doctrine. And part of the rationale for that is that if you try and suppress it, you only end up drawing attention to it and increasing its power and increasing its influence. Much better if somebody is saying something you dislike and you think is dangerous and potentially harmful, poses a threat to the integrity of democracy, much better to counter that with better speech in the public square and defeat those arguments in an honest, good faith way. That was the prevailing wisdom till about 15 years ago. And I think what happened in particular in 2016 with the triumph of Donald Trump in the US presidential election, the triumph of vote leave in the British EU referendum, is that a lot of our ruling elites, both on the right and the left, thought, crikey, we've got a problem here. How are we going to deal with these populist revolts? These elections aren't going the way we wanted them to go. And rather than conclude that they hadn't made a good enough case for globalisation, for mass migration, they hadn't persuaded ordinary people that their policies were actually in their long-term interest, rather than conclude that they needed to make a better fist of making the case for their technocratic managerialist program in the public square, they concluded the only reason they'd lost these contests, these electoral contests, was because of misinformation, bad actors, misleading, credulous members of the electorate who lacked the intelligence to discriminate between false and true information. So the solution, the way of suppressing these populist revolts in future, was suppression, was internet censorship, was to police social media. And it's clearly not working. Trump is about to win, I think, the US presidential election. We saw various populist parties triumph in the European parliamentary elections a few weeks ago. The National Rally came first in the recent parliamentary elections in France, at least in terms of share of the popular vote. So it's not working. But that seems to be the kind of rationale behind this rejection of the counter-speech doctrine and this turn to censorship as a solution to fundamental challenges to the kind of ongoing hegemony of the technocratic managerialist elite. And I think the right have been complicit in this. The kind of center-right have been complicit. They've thought, crikey, these insurgent populist parties like Reform in the UK, like the National Rally in France, they're posing a threat to our ongoing rule, our participation in political rule. And we're therefore going to align ourselves with the left and try and suppress these voices in the hope that their electoral support will then shrink. Actually, it's having the opposite of its intended effect. People who have been in charge in Europe, in America, in Britain, in Australia for since the Second World War, essentially, if they're going to avoid being overthrown by populist insurgent parties and cling on to power, they need to make a better fist of justifying themselves and arguing for their particular programs in the public square. Suppression of criticism, suppression of dissent isn't working.